So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Tickling the Ivories, the Fountain of Youth for Our Brain event. My name is Mary Varakis. I'm Program Manager for Programs for 50 Plus and Community Engagement at the Chang School at Ryerson University. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the land on which Ryerson University is built upon. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I want to pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples, elders, and ancestors who stewarded and cared for the nature and people who lived on the land where Ryerson University is located today. I personally also would like to pay my respects to the families and communities that are grieving the loss of the 215 innocent Indigenous children's lives and the thousands more who are still missing that were lost as a result of the residential school system. Today actually is the 6th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report and the 94 calls to action. At the university, we have made a deep and long-lasting commitment to truth and reconciliation, but clearly there is still much work to be done, and also to bring home the missing children to their families and community to be able to heal the ongoing intergenerational trauma. I invite you to learn more about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report online at trc.ca. Now, I'd like to go over just a few quick items on how to participate in today's workshop. Please ensure that your microphone is muted throughout the workshop so as not to disturb other attendees and our presenter today. Please refrain from having your video on. However, if you do choose to keep video on, please be mindful that any actions on your end are visible to everyone else on the call. For the hearing impaired, we have automated captioning available, which you can access by activating in the toolbar that's located at the bottom of your screen. You will have an opportunity to submit any text questions to today's presenter at the end of the presentation by just typing your questions into the chat box, which is located in the right-hand control panel. And please note, opinions expressed in the event today by our speaker are the speakers and do not necessarily express the views or opinions of Ryerson University. The information presented in the workshop is for general information purposes only. I would like to now introduce our guest speaker, Patricia Izbicki, for today's workshop. Dr. Patricia Izbicki is a clinical research manager at the John P. Hussman Institute for Human Genomics at the University of Miami and an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of West Florida. Patricia is a neuroscientist and classical pianist and harpsichordist. Her research focuses on understanding the brain mechanisms of complementary therapies such as music training in aging adults and persons with Parkinson's disease. Patricia's doctoral work focused on comparing inhibitory brain activity and circuitry of aging musicians and non-musicians. Her goal is for her research to ultimately guide in designing accessible and evidence-based music interventions. She received her doctoral training in neuroscience in the lab of Dr. Elizabeth Stegmuller at Iowa State University, focusing on music education and gerontology. She currently also serves as medical writer for SB Pharma Solutions. Patricia's experiences have motivated her research program to focus on the clinical and educational implications of music training on the aging brain, with the goal to affect health and educational policy regarding music therapy and music education in the United States where she is located. Welcome, Patricia Izbicki. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Mary, for that warm introduction, and for the Chang School for having me. I'm really excited to share some of the work today with you of the music and neuroscience field, and also my own work. So today's presentation is titled Tickling the Ivories, the Fountain of Youth for Our Brain. So I do want to make just a couple of disclosures before we begin. So I recently actually switched roles and started as a medical science liaison at AbbVie slash Allergan. And I'm also, as Mary mentioned before, a medical writing consultant at this time for SB Pharma Solutions. All right, so my work kind of begins and my interest and kind of how it relates to this topic with growing up in Florida. So I was, although I was not born there, I spent most of my life in the panhandle of Florida. And so we were taught and kind of learned the legend of Ponce de Leon and his search for the fountain of youth. And so, you know, obviously the fountain hasn't been found, but, you know, we are still searching in a variety of different manners, right? So in terms of aging, our population is growing, the aging population is growing, and we really need to find several sources of our fountain of youth now more than ever. So just giving you a rundown of some general statistics, the older adult population will be more than 2 billion in the year of 2050. And not only is this going to be an economic burden potentially with health-related deficits or things like that, but also a burden on families in addition to the healthcare system. And so we see as we age that we have a decline in ability to complete activities of daily living and also individual activities of daily living. So what does that mean? Activities of daily living are just your basic functions of eating, bathing, getting dressed, going to the bathroom, things like that. And then individual activities of daily living are kind of more along the lines of, are you able to drive a car? Are you able to manage your finances? How is your communication relationship with other family members, with friends, things like that? And so again, as we get older, we decline in this ability to complete these ADLs and IADLs. So knowing this, the way I approached my research is from the perspective of a musician as well as a music educator. So this picture is just a concert of 4 harpsichords. We were playing some of the Bach Concerti. There's me in the middle there. This is pre-pandemic, so don't be alarmed with the no face mask usage. But as a musician and an educator, going back to this and others, we've noticed like, hey, there are a lot of powerful effects that anecdotally we feel we see in our students, whether they're young children or young adults or middle-aged adults or even older adults. And so, you know, we have some anecdotal type of evidence, but is this actually a real phenomenon? So interestingly, both not only in young children, but also as we age and in older adults, music training has been seen as a potential alternative strategy to keeping our brains young in a sense. So first, I'll talk a little bit about these studies that show that music training is a viable option for healthy aging. And then also the great thing is that it's cost effective and there's minimum side effects. All right, so these are just a couple of studies I'll start out with that really form the foundation, I feel like, of the neuroscience, music, and aging realm. So this first study here found that older adults with at least 10 years of music experience in their lifespan displayed better performance in a lot of different types of cognitive tasks. This included memory, included executive functioning, and so essentially this group of 10 years or more of music experience of older adults did better in a lot of different types of cognitive tests versus those who had less than 10 years of musical experience. And the second study essentially found all of that, but they also controlled for physical activity and social activity, because you can always make the argument like, well, is it really the music or is it the social aspect of playing in a community band or in a choir? And then physical activity, be like, well, maybe people who are musicians also just take better care of themselves. And the second study controlled for both of those and said, regardless of whether there is high physical activity or high social activity and overall health, we still see that musicians or older adults with some music experience are still performing better in these cognitive tasks. All right, and so okay, well, this is great, wonderful, but what if I'm not a musician? What if I just want to start playing an instrument? Well, I still see some of those same benefits as it versus, if I were to start like really young, like I can't go back and do that. Good news is it seems like you can gain a lot of those similar cognitive benefits even if you start playing a musical instrument later in life. So this first study here by Dr. Bugos at the University of South Florida, she found that adults who did not have any previous music experience or music training had enhanced different areas of cognition, such as flexibility, working memory, processing speed. And it was only after 6 months of piano training, which I think that is just incredible that it just takes 6 months and potentially you may be able to see benefits. This study over here is again by Dr. Bugos, and it found that not only is there benefits in cognition, but you also have benefits in motor control, or essentially in movement, which there are also a lot of decrements as we get older, and that just natural progression of aging in terms of movement. And so she found that there's better synchronization of limbs in terms of musicians versus non-musicians as they age. All right, so we know that music training, based on some of these other studies and additional studies that I won't have time to cover today, we know, okay, there's something going on where music training, previous music training, or even starting a musical instrument or music training of any sort later in life has benefits on our behavior or cognition, things like executive functioning, memory, etc. But like, do we see any differences in the brain? What's happening in the brain? And so Dr. Elaine and colleagues did a study where, okay, let's put two groups through interventions. One will be a music training intervention and the other one will be a visual art intervention. And so there are surprisingly differences we see in electrical brain activity in older adults who go through a music training intervention versus a visual art training intervention. And so that's great. We see some differences. So there's some kind of neural signature that we can start to unravel. And there's other studies as well that I'll just briefly mention here. We know that if you began an instrument and continued over your lifespan, that brain changes associated with music training are remaining intact even when the training has stopped for 7 years. Also, lifelong engagement in music training has been shown to keep the brain in a younger state. Again, that specific study, this younger brain study, that was done using data collected over time. So it was more of an observational type of study, but nonetheless, there is potentially a way that there is some evidence that the brain remains in a younger state. And also we see enhanced neural functioning. So there is definitely evidence to say like, hey, there are differences in the brain between older musicians and non-musicians, and that these may be beneficial to overall brain health as we age. So my own work at Iowa State University in the neurophysiology lab also showed that musicians across the lifespan have demonstrated enhanced processing speed, better control of movements, and then also potentially more refined brain pathways. So this was my doctoral work, and I'll talk a little bit more about those findings later, but it seems that there really is something going on, not only with cognition, but also with movement, with either preserving or enhancing movement control. And all of this leads us to really try to advocate that music is not a luxury, but it's truly a necessity. Okay, so I've given you kind of a plethora, maybe a little too overwhelming, but just evidence for, okay, we see aging musicians and even older adults who begin music at a later age, they have enhanced cognition. There are changes in the brain going on, but why? Like, what is so special about music training that it has these effects? So, as the title here shows, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why your brain will thank you for being a musician, and kind of getting into more of what's happening on a more mechanistic level here. All right, so first, and one of the most important components of music training is that it promotes neuroplasticity. So we call this the Hebbian principle. So essentially, neurons that fire together wire together. And this principle is really present in every single kind of skill that you learn throughout your life. In other words, this means the more you engage in any activity, the more consistently neurons are firing together, which is resulting in stronger connections between those neurons. And again, remember, neurons are cells that are found in the brain. So the more you do an activity, the more consistently these neurons are really these brain pathways that consist of neurons are firing together, and you have stronger connections. And you might think, okay, well, if any skill really enhances this, like, why is music training so special? Well, it is one of the only activities that can induce neuroplastic changes in all areas of the brain. Let me show you what I mean here. So this beautiful image is from Sarkamo et al. From the peer-reviewed journal article. And we could go through each of these categories involved in learning to play an instrument. But what I think is the most powerful, if you just look at the dots, they are all over the brain. So just perceiving the basic musical features and listening to them involves certain areas of the brain. Perceiving higher order musical features, so harmony, intervals, rhythm, you're going to have different parts of the brain be involved in that, and et cetera, et cetera. So it is seriously a full brain workout, and very rarely do other activities provide such stimulation. All right, so we're done with neuroplasticity. That was the first reason. Second reason, music training improves cognitive ability. So we talked about this a few slides ago. So again, these several studies, I mean, a plethora really, have shown that music training, not only as a child or in previous years, but even as an older adult, starting as an older adult, improves cognitive abilities like memory, attention, inhibition, or being able to focus on the task at hand across the lifespan. And like I said before, this has been shown with both short term, so that's 6-month musical training with adults with no previous experience, and then those who have been practicing for a longer time. So bringing back that neuroplasticity element, because playing a musical instrument is going to require all these different areas of the brain. You're going to strengthen a variety of neural connections and pathways. And several studies have shown that this may cause an increase in signal efficiency. So how quickly essentially neurons are communicating with each other across the different lobes of the brain, across the different hemispheres. And this increase in signal efficiency and communication of the pathways and the neurons may be why musicians perform better in some of these cognitive tasks than non-musicians. And I also am breaking down here whenever I talk about cognitive abilities or executive function. What does that mean? So that can mean a variety of things, but this is how we'll define it for the presentation. So we mean things like being able to organize and prioritize your work, being able to self-regulate, short-term memory, long-term memory, being able to regulate emotions, remaining focused, being able also to shift attention, but also focus on the task at hand. So music training, we've seen in most all of these throughout the lifespan that music training benefits a lot of these elements of executive function. All right, so reason number 3 why we think, why your brain will thank you for being a musician. Music training may promote healthy aging of the brain. All right, so we've talked about several studies that show that musicians have an advantage in maintaining cognitive abilities during the aging process. And this is both also reflected in terms of brain differences and potentially a younger brain. So for example, one study showed that the ability to filter out irrelevant environmental stimuli, so being able to filter out noise or distractors, or in one word, being able to focus, was more intact in older musicians. And also their brain activity seems to have reflected this advantage. And again, you have both long-term and short-term uh, training benefits. So again, you don't necessarily need to be playing a music instrument for your entire life. You can start later in life and still have some of those benefits. So in terms of my own research, I really focused on what we call inhibitory control. And so focused on 2 elements: that focus issue, being able to filter out irrelevant stimuli, or I define as cognitive inhibition. And then I also looked at motor inhibition, being able to control movements. I'm sure that everyone here has had someone that's an older adult, maybe have a bad fall or break a hip, or not be able, if someone has a neurodegenerative disease, not be able to control movements quite as well because of degeneration of specific subsets of neurons. And so, motor inhibition is kind of a very important skill to also develop, although it's commonly, I feel like, overlooked. So I looked at both of these elements and did 4 experiments. And so in experiment 1, what we found essentially was that musicians all across the lifespan had enhanced processing speed rather than cognitive inhibition. So meaning that they were better able to quickly integrate information and respond to it. Which is also important, but it seems like, well, maybe inhibition is not really involved as much here as has been shown in other studies. Then in experiment 2, we found that, motor circuitry, or like the brain circuitry involved in motor inhibition, essentially remains the same between musicians and non-musicians, but only when they're at rest. So if you're just sitting there, then your motor, specifically your hand area pathways, or your motor, in this case, your motor pathways, are the same as a non-musician. But the difference comes when you start to actually move. So whenever you're doing a syncopated finger tapping task, so moving in between and on a particular click, that's kind of what I used for that experiment, essentially showed that music training and practice seems to help you do better in this kind of a task, and maybe have better motor inhibition, both neurally or in the brain, and also behaviorally. And this was shown in both younger and older musicians.
Hey Siri.
And then the last experiment, experiment 4, musicians across the lifespan may have more refined brain pathways. And this goes back to that neuroplasticity principle and that signal efficiency principle here too. And again, in musicians across the lifespan. All right, and just don't you worry, like, my experiments were done in 2020, but they're, I finished with my PhD in 2020. And because of the pandemic, things have slowed down in the scientific research process and endeavors quite a bit, but there has still been things coming out in the last year that involve music training in older adults and what's happening behaviorally and in the brain. And I'll just kind of briefly go through each of these here. So we have this first article here is that musical instrumental training improves verbal memory and neural efficiency. So going back to that being, different areas of the brain being able to communicate faster in novice older adults. So meaning in older adults who haven't had previous music training. So you had one study that again kind of confirmed everything we've been looking at or we've been talking about in this presentation. We've had a study on music training and brain volume in older adults, and that also there seems to be a greater amount of brain volume, particularly in the prefrontal lobes and music training. In terms of controlling for music training, and musicians seem to have greater brain volume throughout their lifespan, which is great because as we age, our brains naturally do start to atrophy, or essentially neurons start to die off. So having more brain volume may be also kind of a fountain of youth, so to speak, and music training may be able to provide that. All right, this study down here is that long-term music exposure, and this was done in rats, prevents age-related cognitive deficits. So the keynote here is that they found this with just music exposure. And there, one thing I want to key in on, and we'll talk about in a second, for one of the reasons is that you really need to train on a musical instrument of some sort to experience the most benefits, not just listening to music. But they found some of that in rats right in this study. So I thought that was pretty fascinating and interesting. And then you have this study here. They haven't found any results, but there is a huge clinical trial going on in Germany and Switzerland of a music training intervention and taking measures in cognition and biomarkers and different measures of the brain using fMRI, things like that. So that's going to be a really important and seminal study that's coming out and is under right now currently collecting data. And then the last one, which I think, okay, great, we have all of these benefits on cognition, and it seems like there is changes in the brain happening with music training, but you also have improvements in different clinical features. So for example, music training improved depressed mood symptoms in elderly individuals. So you have not only the healthy brain and enhancing the healthy brain, but also helping in clinical areas of research. However, I would be remiss and not a good scientist if I didn't tell you, like, there is just a lot of issues we still have to overcome to make sure that we really are seeing these benefits. And I'm just going to talk about this issue so you as a consumer of research, or maybe you're a scientist yourself that's new in this field, can kind of think about when you're reading articles or maybe designing your experiments or just even your own thought experiments. So there have been a lot of studies that have been published evaluating musical interventions and a lot in healthy populations, but also in populations with different diseases and disorders. But the evidence is really mixed, and there's a lot of limitations. So for example, risk of bias. One example of bias is that I've told you that I'm a music teacher, and I'm also, or I was a music teacher, and I also was a musician, or am a musician. And so of course, like, I want to see these things work. And so because I already have that bias of going in, that, those sorts of biases, that may affect how I interpret my results. And there is a committee, at least here in the United States, from the National Institutes of Health that is working on designing teams to reduce this types of risks of bias. The second thing is sample sizes. So generally, a lot of these studies have very small sample sizes. And so we don't really know if what we're seeing is actually applicable to the entire population. So more and more research is getting funded to be able to include a lot of people in the actual studies and or increasing sample sizes, in other words. You have differences in outcome measures across studies. And so there's just been, in using all of these different tests, like sometimes you have differences in those tests that are individual differences that we're not really taking account into, or that the test might be slightly varied, but is still technically measuring the same construct. Sometimes those differences are important to keep in mind, and may contribute to why the evidence is mixed, etc. And I think the last thing, the intrinsic variability in the population. So are we taking into account whether or not individuals that participate in these research studies have music experience previous? Are they doing things now? Are we controlling for things like socioeconomic status, physical activity, social activity? I mean, the list goes on and on. So having the proper controls in order is really important. And also, even things like personality differences make a difference when doing this types of research. So just accounting for a lot more variables and individual differences than we have in the past. But essentially where the field is going towards is combining music interventions and neuroscience, which we've been talking all about this presentation. And so we hope, we'll have a better understanding after all of these different clinical trials and individual research studies of networks for familiar music, music and reward, what happens with spontaneous brain activity, pre and post music training, for example, what happens in terms of neurodegenerative disorders with rhythmic stimulation of motor networks, and also what's happening in brain pathways that are bilateral or on both sides of the brain. So there's a lot of questions that both music training and neuroscience can answer together, which is really great. All right. So I hope I've convinced you that music training may promote healthy aging of the brain, even though there's still hurdles we got to overcome. It seems like so far the scientific literature is really indicating that the phenomenon is truly there. But number 4, music listening and training is beneficial for overall health. So I kind of I did a foreshadowing of this with the rat study and cognition in a couple slides ago, where rats just listening to music scientists found benefits in different cognitive skills. And so we see some similar things, not only with listening, but also with training. So a recent study has shown that group musical activities are potential ways to maintain physical and psychological health. So one example of a study was that there was a lower risk of dementia when individuals played musical instruments, and this was association. Other studies have shown that playing a keyboard or drums could improve fine or gross motor skills, so little movements and big movements, particularly in stroke patients. So you have also these benefits, again, accompanied by increased brain activity and improved connectivity and function of brain areas. So, we have both these musical training elements that seem to work really well, but also we potentially might have just music listening alone helping. And so one of the most, I guess, known ways is music listening and dementia. And so I'm not going to play this trailer, but I would recommend, if you haven't seen Alive Inside, it's a very interesting documentary, kind of taking a look at the anecdotal evidence and phenomenon of music being able to elicit what we call autobiographical memories, or memories that from childhood or young adult years, and why music does that. And that is a whole talk in and of itself that I won't get into, but even just in this particular disease state or disorder, you do see that phenomenon just with music listening, which is really, really wonderful. All right, so another example, just again, because we've talked a lot about music training, but music listening does also have benefits, is in persons with Parkinson's disease. So what we generally see is when an individual is walking with music or rhythmic auditory stimulation, or trained to use music as a tool to help with walking, that in Parkinson's disease improves a lot. It improves things like velocity and gait stride. Overall, it just improves walking and walking stability. And so I'm going to show you a little video here that demonstrates that, because I think that it's a very powerful thing. And I remember starting grad school when I saw this, it made a very powerful impression on me. So this individual, again, walking without music. And here there's freezing of gait, which commonly happens, and you just can't get your feet to move and trying to get around the corner. And again, just really a struggle to try to get past that freezing. And you can't really hear well with this audio, but there is music playing in the background. And the individual here, I mean, it's nothing like what we saw in the previous version where there's freezing of gait. And you can go on YouTube and look up a lot of different videos that show, music versus non-music and persons with Parkinson's disease and gait or walking. And this in and of itself is also a whole separate talk that you could attend. Very fascinating research. All right, so we know music, not only music training, but potentially music listening in different neurological disorders could be very beneficial for overall health. So that was the number 4. My 5th reason is that music listening and training is a rewarding activity. So I think we know this from personal experience, but also we see in research the brain is more apt to learn if an activity is actually rewarding and motivating, or if it's something you care about, right? In other words. So we know that listening to music is a rewarding experience in and of itself, and activating brain structure, and it activates brain structures involved in reward processing. And so, for example, a recent study that I alluded to has shown that exposing rats to melodic music increases dopamine and serotonin. So this was a separate experiment where they just looked at what's happening with different neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, involved in reward and motivation, and just listening to music increases those. And there's also studies done in the human brain, particularly by Dr. Zatori's lab, that show very similar types of things and more in depth, and obviously in humans, so more applicability. Okay, so I bombarded you with information, but if anything, I really want you to take away these 4 things of why music training works first. So it works because it's complex. It's not an easy thing to learn, right? It's pleasurable, it's motivating, and also induces neuroplasticity in various regions of the brain. And so all those combined, you have a successful intervention to potentially maintain brain health. And where I would say many of my colleagues feel like this area is heading is towards something that maybe doctors can prescribe to patients. And we already hear of doctors prescribing music listening and things like that in other countries. At least I've heard mainly in Europe. But I think this is where we want to get to as a field, where we can have something that's been through a clinical trial, a music training intervention that's been through a clinical trial and is FDA approved, and we know it works. And so some people are like, well, we have a long way before we can do that. And I agree, but it doesn't mean it can't be done. And the slide really represents a lab that has done something similar, but with video games that have been approved for children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD. And so I just provide this as an example that it's not unheard of for a video game and a digital intervention at that to be something that we prescribe to individuals with different disorders, and that could be the future of our field, and it would be an amazing future, I think. So maybe you want to get involved in somehow bringing something like this to fruition, or just for your own curiosity. And there are 2 shout outs I will make to incredible labs at Ryerson University. So first, this is the Stress and Healthy Aging Research Lab, or the STAR Lab. This is Dr. Alexandra Fioco's lab. If you want to get involved with more healthy aging and music and wellness type of work, definitely this is the lab to do that. And also Dr. Frank Russo's lab. I followed a lot of his work as a graduate student, and I was just always really inspired and motivated and really just in awe of everything that he has done with the choirs and also his music cognition, hearing science, and health and well-being research. So Dr. Russo's Smart Lab does that kind of work if you want to get more involved in that. And then, of course, there's a music program for the Chang School where you can learn and also be involved and research a little bit more. So I just put this up here as well that you can Google and find, but you can Google and find also on the web. Okay, so key takeaways that I would love for you to bring away from this presentation. And the first is making music is a whole brain workout. Even though music training at a young age seems to display potentially greatest neuroplastic benefits, it is never too late. We still see benefits in terms of both cognition and changes in the brain as you get older and begin an instrument at an older age. We need more research, and this is a hot topic in the field right now in terms of music training and the effects on the brain throughout the entire life. And here in the United States, the National Institutes of Health has recognized this, and they've actually formed a committee and a call for grant proposals, which was just totally unheard of when I began grad school back in 2015. So we've come a really long way in a very short amount of time to encourage researchers to keep continuing this line of work and funding them for it. All right. And then those 5 reasons that your brain will thank you for being a musician. Music training promotes neuroplasticity. Music training improves cognitive abilities. Music training may promote healthy aging of the brain. Music listening and training are beneficial for overall health. And then music listening and training, they're both rewarding activities. I'm just going to do some shameless self-promotion here. I have 2 articles that are written for all levels of scientific expertise. And one is on brainfacts.org and it's lessons in music for the healthy aging brain. And then the other one is Your Brain Will Thank You for Being a Musician, which is in part the inspiration behind this talk. If you have any questions or concerns or anything like that, you can feel free to reach out to me via email. I also am on these various social media platforms, so you can feel free to kind of follow my work. And then if you want to hear any of my or read my more scientific papers or hear my recordings or just see my portfolio, I am on Squarespace at this web address. And I will take any questions you have now. Thank you so much for your attention.
I want to say thank you. Thank you so much, Patricia. Just a fascinating presentation and very insightful. And thank you for sharing your research as well. It's very exciting to see the work that you're working on right now. And also the 5 reasons that you highlighted in the presentation on why to consider music for training and healthy aging brain as we get older. There's a lot of information in the presentation today, so I just wanted to remind everyone on the call, we are recording it and we will be sharing it with you after the talk. So no need to write down everything really quickly. If you were writing, not to worry if you missed anything, it will all be available on the video recording that will be sent out to you. So we're ready to turn over to, we have about just a little bit over 10 minutes for a few questions. Patricia, the first question that's come through on the chat box, I can read through is, I heard that musicians pick up on specific noises or sounds when performing because they are so in tune. They also get more distracted when performing. This seems to differ from some of the info presented. Or they aren't easily distracted. Wondering if you could please comment on this phenomenon. Okay.
Sure. So I don't know if in the chat box it was performing like on like in a music performance setting, I assume, correct?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, so that is so first and foremost, that is a very different experience than going into a lab and doing different types of, cognitive psychological tests. So, generally in a lab setting, we have a quiet space, and the task itself is the distractor. So we don't have like people walking around, or we don't have screaming children, which I always adore to hear while I'm performing. So first of all, it's a very different setting. And so there's like this lack of external validity, so to speak, in terms of what we're doing in the lab versus like music performance, which has a lot of different variables. And with music performance, also you have, not only is there noises, but you're maybe in a different state. So you are high alert, you're stressed out, you are under immense pressure, whereas in a lab setting, that just, it's different. So that may be, like, and I totally relate to this because I'm a musician, so I totally get what you're talking about, but it's just a very different setting, and you can't really compare apples to oranges, is what I would say. I don't know of any studies that show, that put musicians into this high pressure situation and then measure their cognition. If I were to propose a hypothesis, like, yeah, you probably wouldn't see as great performance on different cognitive tasks in a high pressure situation like that versus when they're in a lab, a quieter setting. But that could be said of almost any single individual. So it's an interesting research question, I think, but again, my answer is apples and oranges right there. So can't really compare the two.
Um, I recall in the talk you mentioned that learning music in older age, that we can pick up music quite quickly, and the effects are quite dramatic within 6 months. Our next question is asking for clarification. They're saying, did you say that the benefits of musical training when you are younger has not been confirmed to last through old age?
So no, so if you receive music training when you're younger, there are some benefits, but we just don't know whether that's how long you have to train music to experience those benefits, or at least I'm not familiar with a research article that's shown specifically, because I talked about Hannah Platy, the 10 plus years of music training seems to have better benefits than less than 10 years. So that kind of seems to be the foundation, is that this 10 years plus in training when you're younger seems to make a difference versus less than 10. But there could be also different age groups. So we're just starting to explore that now. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of the clarification that I would say would best fit that.
Thank you. Our next question is there any research done that you're familiar with on people who sing in choirs, learn music, but don't play a musical instrument?
Sure. So that's my bias coming out, is instrumental music is a lot of what I talked about. There is definitely a plethora of research on how being in a choir is beneficial for psychological health. I don't know off the top of my head on cognition. In terms of brain differences, the reason why in the music field we've kind of separated vocalists and instrumentalists into two camps, it's not what, just because of a bias, but there are actual brain differences. Like if you imagine, a pianist is going to learn a whole different set of skills than a vocalist, and there are different areas of the brain that control fingers versus vocal cords, and things like that. So there are definitely a lot of studies on wellness in terms of singing in a choir, but in terms of cognition, I'm not quite sure, so I don't want to speak to that.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like our last question here. If there's anyone else has any last questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. Our next question is there any ongoing research? Sorry, my screen just jumped here. Is there any ongoing research on combining music training with transcranial direct current stimulation for added benefit?
Yeah. So that's funny because I really want to do that work. Whoever has that question. I'm trying to, there are definitely several labs that have done that, and musically listening. I know a couple of studies that have done that. I think I've seen a trial out there that is doing something similar. So I can't think of off the top of my head what lab it is, but I do know that there is work like that either being planned or in progress. So yeah, that's a very hot topic, because if we can use brain stimulation plus this additional music training stimulation to enhance brain health, well, that would be absolutely fantastic. So I just can't think of anything off the top of my head, but happy to get back with you, because I just think that area is fascinating.
Excellent. Thank you, Patricia. And next question here is, I have been looking for an opportunity to get involved in research. It's nice to know there is research going on at Ryerson. And thank you, Patricia, for mentioning our collaboration with the 2 research labs at Ryerson University for our music program, 50 plus. The question is, as an oldish person who learned to play an instrument later in life and am indeed noticing changes in brain power, what other key research is going on in the area that you are aware of, perhaps in the US or elsewhere in Canada, that one might get involved with?
Sure. So in Canada, I would definitely look at, I don't know if it's aging necessarily, but Dr. Zatori's lab, he's kind of like, I feel like the father of our field. So he's been doing this work for quite a while. I would look into that lab. I'm trying to think who else.
Is Dr. Satori in the US or located here in Canada?
He's in Canada. He's in Canada. And then also, I'm trying to think of aging work. Let me find a slide. I promise this will be quick here, because one of the studies I talked about, let's see. So the Rotman Research Institute, that's going to have, I think, your best bet for aging music and research, because Dr. Elaine has been doing a lot of work in this field for quite a while. So I think that would be from off the top of my head in Canada, that would be where I would start. In the US, so University of South Florida, for sure. There's a lot of things going on also in San Francisco, at the University of California, San Francisco as well. And I can get you names. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, different people. So yeah. I mean, I would just say, here, I'll go back to my email here. Feel free to email me, whoever it was that asked the question, and I'm happy to provide you a more extensive list, because I'm just spitballing here, but happy to help you find resources in different labs if you're interested.
Can I ask for the spelling of Dr. Zatori's name, and I can enter it into the chat box for everyone if you have that available. If not, we can always email it to everyone.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Actually, I have access to the chat box. So the last name is Zatorre.
C, like zebra?
Uh-huh.
C-O-R-E, Zatori.
And I sent the message to Barbara. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, just sorry, 2 R's, and
okay.
Yeah, and then 1 T.
Okay. Dr. Zatori, thank you. Awesome. Okay, so we are getting close. I think we just have a couple more questions in the chat box. Is the 10 years of music training when you are younger, does that have a differing effect if it's conservatory music versus playing by ear?
Yeah, perfect. We don't know. We don't know. And generally, a lot of these studies, so defining what is a musician is very, I think it's contested in our field, because yeah, maybe we want to look at people who are elite and highly trained in their field to really get at brain mechanisms, but that's not the general population, right? Not all of us are going to be conservatory trained. Some might be by ear, or some might just have formal lessons, or I mean, there's just such a variety of things. So long story short, we are getting there and trying to tease out, okay, well, what kind of training? And I'm sure some of you that have had teachers, like, does the role of the teacher play, what role is that going to play? And I know for me, that's been huge, having an amazing teacher. So then you also have not only the actual pedagogy, but then the teacher themselves and all of this stuff. So long story short, that needs more research, but it's a great question.
Okay, excellent. And we have time for one last question here. Would playing guitar and singing at the same time provide similar health benefits?
Um, it goes, I don't want to say yes because there's more things that to keep in mind is how many years, um, also like how many, also how consistently is one doing that. So is this just like a once a month thing, or is one doing this several times a week? Or in other words, the dosage, like we don't really know what the dosage you actually need. We have these, landmarks of 10 or less than 10, but we don't really know in terms of playing two instruments together, or how long, or things like that. So that's still under debate, is specifically, if we were to give you a prescription, we don't have all of those things that you would see in a prescription that you would get from your doctor and the actual packet. So we know there's benefits, but we don't know if you combine playing an instrument and vocals, does that have a better effect, or is it the same? How much, how little, things like that. So I can't say yes or no to your question. It's also one that needs to be researched.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you so much, Patricia. So we've come to the end of our hour, and it's been a fascinating hour. I want to say thank you so much, Patricia Izbicki, and thank you to everyone for attending today's workshop. I'm sure some of you may be planning to attend additional workshops and possibly explore the music program that Patricia's kindly highlighted and learn more about some of the research that she is doing and the field itself. So we invite you, it has been entered in the chat box, but we invite you to check out through our website, or you can always email us at programs50plus@ryerson.ca for more information. Or if you have any questions that we might have missed and you'd like additional information, I think Patricia has been kind enough to let us forward any additional questions to her. And please do check out her social media channels. There's a lot of fantastic and informative information that Patricia shares through Twitter, Instagram, which is also on LinkedIn, and then again through our website as well. The contact information has been entered in the comment panel, and we're also going to be sending out a follow-up email as well as a survey within 24 to 48 hours. We encourage you, please fill the survey out, provide your feedback so that we know for future talks. We would love to have Dr. Izbicki back again for a future talk if she's willing, and providing more of her innovative research in this field. So in closing, on behalf of the Chang School at Ryerson University and our presenter today, Dr. Patricia Izbicki, thank you so much to each and every one of you for joining us today. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Patricia. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. It was my pleasure.
Bye-bye.